With that, I'm going to introduce Tom. He's, as I mentioned, founder and CEO of 10 Government Strategies, which is a sole proprietorship representing interests of education institutions, organizations, and individuals. He's also the co-executive director of CSPED and brings 30 years of experience working with organizations on development, assessment, and implementation of higher ed policy. Tom, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Great to have you here.
I want to thank everybody for the opportunity to share time with you today in your first webinar. As we go through the slides, as Steve had mentioned, certainly have time for questions at the end, but wanted to try and also provide some time for questions as we actually go through the 4 sections that we're going to go through today. Some of these will be rather brief, and we will certainly do a deeper dive into other sections as we get into the financing aspects and the ways in which I think that the information could, and I emphasize could, because there is still a great deal that candidly none of us have solid concrete answers for, but I can share with you the most recent information with conversations with the Department of Education officials yesterday, people up on Capitol Hill as recently as today, and other wonderful individuals within your community like Richard Hirschman, a longtime friend of mine from the National Association of College Bookstores. So without further ado, the areas that we're going to cover today are the CARES Act, a 30,000-foot overview of major portions that are contained in the appropriation or the funding portion of the bill. I'll also touch at the end very, very briefly on some of the policy provisions related to distance education and encourage you to look at information potentially from the Department of Education in a most recent update that was provided on Friday, April 3rd. Within the CARES Act, we're going to focus on the Education Stabilization Fund, over $30 billion in financing that's broken down into 3 areas. Of those 3, we're going to focus our time and attention on 2 of those. We're going to leave the elementary and secondary education portions to the side and focus on some $3 billion that are being provided to the governors for their ability to share as they see fit with certain guardrails at the state level, and then spend the vast majority of our time on the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund, some $14.25 billion in funds going to the institutions and to students. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Moving to the CARES Act itself, I'm sure many of you are aware and have been watching in the media. This is the 3rd piece of legislation that Congress has enacted in recent weeks and over the course of the last month. The first 2 were focused more directly on healthcare related issues, but did transcend into small businesses as well as other opportunities to try and prop up and sustain the funding and financing for a lot of programs that were starting to see a significant reduction in revenue as a result of the pandemic. Most notably, those funds were, however, directed towards allied health and specifically the ability for doctors, hospitals, nurses, and the entire universe to ramp up for the pending pandemic, which we are now all suffering through. The 3rd in those series of proposals is what is known as the CARES Act, or the Corona Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or CARES Act. Here in Washington, we live in a world of acronyms, and this is just one of many that I'm sure you, as well as your colleagues, are all familiar with at this point. But this 3rd bill actually was the first to focus in on some of the other domestic policy and domestic funding issues, including a significant amount of focus on funding for education, and more specifically, higher education. There were funds and some provisions included in the CARES Act for elementary and secondary, but honestly, if you look both at the policy provisions as well as at the financing provisions, most of those focused more directly on higher education and higher education policy. Some of the reason for that is because Congress is in the midst of going through the pending reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. So staff in both the House and Senate committees with jurisdiction over policy were already attuned to having conversations around higher ed policy, and they attempted to drill down and utilize this as a precursor to that reauthorization to potentially address some issues and specifically offer relief for both students and schools as the pandemic has become, as the onset of the pandemic was arriving, and now as we look into the future of the pandemic. $2.2 trillion overall within the area of, and this is just a snapshot of the front page of the law that was passed on March 27th. It went through the Senate on the 25th of March, went to the House on the 27th, and was signed later that same day by the president. So we're literally just about 2 weeks into the rollout of the CARES Act. So not a lot of time, but a lot of information that has been transpired since the signing of the act into law. Most notably, again, looking at this from a fiscal standpoint, the bill included, or now the law includes, over 30 and almost $31 billion in funding for education. As noted here, and all of the information that I've included on these slides is for your disposal. As Steve said, you'll have this information to refer to later. The information that I've pulled is directly from various source documents from the Department of Education, as well as more directly from Capitol Hill, so that you can refer to them at a later point. But within the 30 and almost $31 billion, there were specific allocations of how much money should go to three specific programs. One, 9.8% was to go to the Governor's Emergency Fund, which you see noted here. Another almost half of the funds was to go to elementary and secondary education. And then another almost half, 43%, almost 43.8% was to go to higher education policy. So there's the split of how the funding under the stabilization portion of the CARES Act was to be put forward. Within that, we're going to focus first on the governor's portion of those funds. These are funds, some $3 billion worth, that are going to be provided directly to the governors so that they can then in turn allocate them within their state in areas of need. There are three aspects that the governors have the ability to utilize their funding for. One is for state LEAs, LEAs and the elementary and secondary portion of education. We're going to focus once again on the higher ed portions and a combined portion of where the funds can be utilized. The funds specifically are, as discussed here, to be used for entities impacted at the institutional level by the coronavirus. Obviously, this relates to all of the unfortunate circumstances with school closures across the entire nation and the implications of that, both in terms of for the student populations, as well as for your the employees of the institutions, as well as the administrators of those institutions. Within the proposal, it talks specifically that the funds should be done in the form of grant assistance, and that those funds should be provided directly to the entities that are deemed appropriate by the governor. The entities then take those funds and can utilize them for a number and a range of different opportunities, which are also specifically spelled out in the statute. When it comes to institutions of higher education, the governors have the ability, as you can see here, to provide those funds for the ongoing function of the institution and also for other specific requirements within the school. We interpret that information to mean everything from things like payroll to can try and maintain and not furlough or have to send individuals home either as furloughed or as let go. It can be utilized as well for the ability to transition to distance education and online, as many institutions have done and continue to do in the wake of the pandemic. And we'll talk about how significantly those funds are also can be utilized that are coming from another form of financing here in a minute. The other portion that is included is the ability for the governor to deem those areas that are essential within elementary and secondary, as well as higher education, as other areas for funding beyond simply the funding that he deems for elementary and secondary LEAs or for institutions of higher education. We think that in particular, that may lead to specifically targeted programs for some of the areas regarding education and training that deal with allied health, given the number of and the concerns around the growing individuals on the front lines, both practitioners as well as nurses and others that are unfortunately falling ill based on the virus as well, that there could be a focus on allied health related programs and the need for institutions offering programs in nursing or the practitioners or others to have utilization of these funds to sustain and maintain the ability for those individuals to continue their training in order to enter the workforce and be part of the frontline servicers. Obviously, as we look at the informed information that the next round of funding that Congress will consider being heavily focused on infrastructure, you can make the case that some of the next round of funding that may be utilized could be on some of the blue collar work related industries, the true trades and the like, and providing opportunities for the programs that will help to ensure that the workforce is there to meet the needs and the demand of infrastructure funding and the ability to then build, no pun intended, on the focus of that particular additional portions of the statute as they might come in the next round. But the primary focus of today's call and the time that we have is to talk a little bit about the $14.25 billion that goes to institutions of higher education. Those funds are specifically laid out in order to, as you can see from the discussion, to defray the expenses for institutions, including the revenue, technology costs associated with the transition, and the grants to students for everything related to cost of attendance. It is important to emphasize here that in the cost of attendance, as it is written specifically in the law, it does emphasize course materials. One of the areas where I think obviously this community plays a significant role and has a specific opportunity to be engaged in those discussions is around course material for the students, and certainly you have a role to play and have already played as it relates to course curriculum material and the institutional side. In terms of the distribution of that $14.25 million, 90% of it, the vast majority, is directed to go specifically to institutions, and it's based on a calculation methodology on the number of students that were enrolled in the institution that were not previously online, that because of the pandemic are now having to shift and move into the virtual environment. And when I say online or distance education, it's important to note that the statute and the regulations do not prescribe that it be necessarily the traditional LMS format or has to be the full online structures that many of us are accustomed to and many of the institutions use for true distance education and online. The department has already provided some additional information in the form of an April 3rd electronic announcement that explains that those methodologies can be interaction that is more akin to or aligned with simply email and Zoom meetings like this between the instructor and the students, or other forms of delivery and modalities that don't necessarily mean the full-fledged outset of distance education programs. So what I'm saying there is it offers a broad array of opportunities for institutions to start to provide that education dating back to the beginning of March and to continue to move forward for the length of the pandemic as we see how long this stretches, and hopefully we all work right now to continue to flatten the curve. In addition to the 90%, and I'm going to talk about how that 90% is further delineated and allocated specifically in just a minute, there was specific funding that's also available to targeted institutions, those being those historically Black colleges and universities, minority institutions, and others. They have designated portions both here and later that talks about the need to make sure that funds are arriving for those institutions and the opportunity for them to continue to sustain their operations and delivery to students. But what we're going to focus on is that broad 90% for the most part. Within that 90%, as I said, they made the determination that the allocations would be based on two facets. Granted, once again, this is all students who were previously enrolled students, and looking at an assessment of aid based on 75% going to the full-time equivalent of Pell eligible students, and the other 25% derived from those portions of students at the institution that were not Pell eligible. So we're placing a heavier emphasis, and Congress is placing a heavier emphasis, as you might imagine, on those individuals with need-based aid and need-based financing, and therefore the recognition that, especially in these trying times, not that everybody isn't hurting and that everybody doesn't need access, but that those individuals with already challenges associated with their ability to attend post-secondary education are likely to need even more help, and the funds, therefore, that are going to flow from the federal government to those institutions should likewise flow to those institutions with heavier numbers of at-risk and needy students. The use of the funds, and this is where the rubber truly hits the road, is developed and focused on two areas. And it's a 50-50 apportionment of those funds, both to the institution and to the students they serve. The statute is very, very clear, and the law is very, very clear that at least and no less than 50% of the funds must go directly to the students. Again, that is for issues in order to continue to hopefully sustain their continuation in post-secondary education so that the individuals don't have to withdraw or drop out. The Department of Education has put forth a great deal of guidance on issues related to certainly the recognition of individuals who unfortunately contract COVID or have family members or have other extenuating circumstances that force them to withdraw, on how institutions are to address and deal with those circumstances. But the goal of Congress and the goal of these funds is to try to the degree possible to ensure that all students that are capable of continuing their education and the institutions that are providing it have the ability to continue to do so. On the funding side for the students, again, it talks specifically about the fact that those funds should be used for expenses related to cost of attendance. Again, I draw your attention specifically to the language included there that talks about course materials. That certainly gives the opportunity for you all and the offerings that you provide to be part of the discussion as the institutions are delivering those funds to students. One of the things that I've talked about with Rich and with others is that I think one of the things you might strive for, and maybe the National Association of College Bookstores will work towards, is language that could be utilized to help promote the assurance that as the funds are being delivered to students, they're aware of the depth and breadth of ways in which those funds can be utilized. Obviously, the ultimate decision is up to the student, but the ability to provide recommendations or at least full awareness that those funds can be used for course materials and delineate what some of those are could be to the benefit of our community. On the institutional side, again, the major focus is on the ability to assist institutions in transitioning to distance education online in all of its modalities to sustain the ability for students to continue their education. But that's not the only utilization of the funds. In other areas of the statute, it makes very, very clear that institutions have the capability to use these funds for a considerable amount of different opportunities, lost revenue, payroll, again, with the mindset of trying to keep as many of the employees at the institution employed as possible and not furloughed or unfortunately having to part ways with the institution. It does also emphasize that while these funds can be utilized for a plethora of different things, there are certain and specific things they cannot be used for. They cannot be used for marketing and recruiting and advertising and a contractual basement for pre-enrollment activities. They cannot be used for the continuation of or focused use of endowments, and they cannot be used for construction funds. And they also cannot be used for issues and services related to the athletic departments of the institution. You can see here that Congress was driving these funds, and the intent is to drive these funds towards true continuation of the delivery of the academics to all the individuals that they possibly can provide it to. To help you a little bit, one of the things that I thought might be important to note, and this is one of two studies that have been done, was when you look at these financing, and one of the logical questions is, well, how much is each institution likely to receive? And I do emphasize that all institutions across the entire spectrum of higher education are eligible for this financial assistance if they participate in the federal student financial aid programs. So I give great kudos to the American Council on Education, because right as this was being enacted into law on March 27th, they spent the weekend doing basically more than the back of an envelope type of assessment of how much financing individual institutions might be eligible to receive. working in conjunction with NASFA, again, a long acronym, which stands for the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators. ACE put out information that kind of gives a assessment of what may be the funding that is provided for each institution. And what they did was they broke it down both in terms of state, alpha order by state, and then alpha order by institution within the state. This is just a snapshot and a scroll through of what that information looks like from the preliminary analysis of ACE. So you have the ability, and I will certainly share with Steve, the ability for you to have access to this information. I would remind you, utilize it as a resource, but not necessarily as a definitive determination of how much financing each institution might receive. That will be the determination of the Department of Education based on their variables and their criterion. ACE did outline what the variables that they utilized in their calculation methodology looked like. There also is more recent information, thank you, Rich, that you shared with me regarding a congressional research study, CRS, that put forth state-by-state allocations as they assume they might be provided, not broken down then by institution, but at least giving some determination of what the allocations at the state level might look like. So I will also make sure that information and access for that is provided to RedShelf, so it can be provided to you as well. All of this to then say that those funds are available to be utilized in the broadest sense as we've discussed, but the devil of the detail resides with the ability for now the U.S. Department of Education to take the guidance provided in the statute and really start to provide the finances to institutions. The statute says that the funds should be delivered to institutions in much the same way as they're delivered through the process of financial aid. But in doing so, we have a number of questions on the time it is going to take for institutions to be able to receive those funds. Unfortunately, the best guidance and the best determinations we have, and having talked with Department of Ed officials yesterday, is that it's probably going to take a while. The Washington Post noted today that it's going to take a while for the Paycheck Protection Program to deliver funds to individuals. You can expect it's going to take a while for the department to complete their development and analysis of how they're going to deliver the funds, when they're going to deliver them, an application process that might be included, and then the requirements that are going to go along with the tracking and the reporting back to the department of those funds. I ran a little long, Dave, I'm sorry, but a lot of information to try and deliver in a short period of time. So I turn it back over to you, maybe for a few questions, and with the commitment, as you and I talked about before, that all the questions that we receive we'll attempt to put down in writing and then share responses after the fact. With that, I want to thank you, RedShelf, and you, Dave, Steve, for once again giving me the opportunity, and I'll turn it back over to you, Steve.
Thanks, Tom. Appreciate it. If anyone has a question, they can unmute themselves and throw it out there as we're closing up the last few minutes of the session here. I didn't see anything come through chat, but we did have, Tom, a couple come through about the application process, which you just mentioned. Was it initially, there was not an application to be planned, and now the potential for one to be implemented?
There is, that is correct. The statute itself does not talk about an application process. But as you can imagine, with $14.25 billion being dispersed and allocated to the institutions, the department has a number of individuals certainly watching over them that are going to want to see how those funds are in fact dispersed and allocated, and are going to want to have some degree of certainty, even within the structure of the use of funds that we've already talked about, of how those funds are being dispersed and where the funds are actually going. So I do believe that there may be an application process. The unfortunate part is that could slow down the delivery of the funds, which I know institutions are looking for yesterday. But I think that the department obviously has a number of responsibilities and a number of individuals that they're beholden to that may make this to be a little bit more prudent. The one other thing I will say is, in talking with Department of Ed officials, and I know this is hard to hear, but I'll deliver the message from them. And while I can tell you with benediction that they are working very, very hard and long hours to try and develop both the guidance in terms of a number of policy provisions and the ability to disperse these funds. They've got to take their time on this. And what they've asked for from the community, to the degree possible, is a little bit of patience.
Thanks, Tom. Is anyone attending right now interested in throwing a question out to Tom in our last minute or so? One just came through chat, Tom. Do we have a sense on the for the percentage of students on federal aid, like Pell Grants?
Again, that information is probably best served by looking at what CRS has put forward. It's interesting, again, going back to the ACE study, they did a preliminary analysis. They did do a good job of breaking down the percentage of full-time equivalents that are Pell eligible versus the ones that aren't, and then give you a rolled up total. I'll share that information with you, and it's something that your community can look at their leisure.
Great. Well, that puts us exactly at time. We have maybe, okay. So that was not an additional question. Great. So we're going to close then. If there are additional questions, you can send them my direction, steve.mendez, M-E-N-D-E-Z, at RedShelf.com. And I'll make sure that they get over to Tom, and we'll do some follow-up, as he mentioned, and make sure that you get a follow-up communication on the resources that he's mentioned to be available after this session. Also, this recording, again, will be on our YouTube channel, and you'll be able to view that on, or find a link to the YouTube channel on about.redshelf.com/connections. So with that, thank you again, Tom, for joining us. It was great to hear more about the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund today and the details that were set forth in it recently, and the even more recent changes. So thanks again for that. And with that, we will close our first Infosandwich session of RedShelf Connections. Everybody have a great day.
Thank you again.
Thank you.